Welcome to the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. My name is Diana Terrell. I'm a faculty member here in the Education Department. And with Joe Anosco, who's a faculty member in the Education Department at UNH, we're very happy to bring you Dr. Diana Hess and Dr. Paula McAvoy to the campus today. So I just wanted to let you know a little bit about why I'm so excited to bring Diana Hess and Paula McAvoy here today. I began my social studies teaching career in Fairfield, Connecticut in September of 2001. And at that time, of course, we didn't know that 2 weeks into my first year of teaching, we would have, it would be 9/11, and we would have 2 jetliners crash into the World Trade Center. And so I knew right away at that point, I was trained as an Americanist, so I knew a lot about American history, but I knew I really had to brush up on global history. But that was just the very beginning of the kind of work that I needed to do to get myself ready to deal with what was going to happen in the classroom when I came to work. So our school, many students lost parents, many faculty and colleagues lost siblings and loved ones, and it was pretty significant for our campus in particular, as it was for the whole nation. So as a first-year teacher, I really had little sense of what to do. I think many of us didn't really know what to do at that point. But really, I understood the role that I played as a social studies teacher would be really, I had to do something. I couldn't just not do anything, and I couldn't not address what was happening, despite all of my misgivings. So I really felt in that year, as most first-year teachers do, I felt woefully unprepared, but I felt exceptionally unprepared to deal with these controversial discussions in the classroom. So slavery and the road to sectionalism is one set of controversial discussions, but this was an historically grounded global crisis that we were encountering at that moment. And it really merited hammering through some of those issues that are central to democracy. How do we deliberate over issues that are really controversial, but do so in a meaningful way, in a way that's not going to create total chaos in the classroom, but also be cognizant of the sense of loss and the true fear that the students were feeling at that time, because this is so geographically close to where we were. Unfortunately, I didn't come across Diana Hess's work until my first year of my doctoral program, after I had left high school classroom teaching. But I'm very happy to have her here today with Paula. Their recent title, The Political Classroom, offers social studies more than just strategies for dealing with controversial issues in the classroom, but also the research that clarifies what students learn from doing this work in the classroom, from being part of these discussions, and the ethical and historical role that social studies teachers play in engaging and educating future citizens, today's citizens and future citizens. So I'm very, truly happy to welcome Dr. Hess and Dr. McAvoy to campus today, and thank you for coming.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Paula McAvoy, and I just want to say thank you to St. Anselm for the invitation. We're both very excited to be here. And just to give you a little idea of how we're structuring this first hour, I'm going to give you about a 10 or 15-minute introduction to the book and sort of get into it a little bit, and I'm going to hand the floor over to Diana, and hopefully that'll be about a 40-minute talk or so total, and then we'll have some question and answers before we have a break. Okay, so we'll get right into it. So I'm going to actually begin the talk with a story about my mom. And my mom is retired, and for many years she's been a member of a women's philanthropy group whose mission is primarily to serve in various ways high-need schools. And one role that my mom has played was she was on the reading committee, and as a member of the reading committee, every year she would get assigned a second or third grade classroom. And once a month, she would go to the class, read 2 books that was provided by the organization, read the books, have a little discussion with the students, and then donate the books to the class. So she loved doing this. In 2009, there was a meeting of the membership of the reading committee, and to go over what books would be read that year. And so the chair of the committee said, we're going to read this in September, et cetera. Gets to February, it's Black History Month, and we're going to read this book, Barack Obama, Out of Many, One. And immediately a hand goes up from the reading committee to say, we can't read that book. That's a political book, and we're not a political organization. And so this begins an immediate discussion of the reading committee. Is it a political book? Are we a political organization? What should we do? The chair of the committee listens to this debate, eventually says, we're reading the book. If you don't want to read the book, you can have someone else read the book for you in February. That was not satisfactory to the woman who brought the objection, and so she went to the president of the organization and said, it's a political book, we're not a political organization. The president listened to this and said, we're not reading the book. Sends an email to the reading committee, do not read the book. The chair of the reading committee immediately launches an email campaign to the 200-member organization, arguing that we should read the book. The president, under pressure from the organization, says we will have a general meeting of the entire organization where we will debate whether or not to read Barack Obama out of many one to second and third graders. So the membership comes, raucous debate. They decide we will read the book. The book is read. Members of the reading committee quit the reading committee. Some members quit the entire organization over this. So what is the point of this story? So this word political, the objection, we can't read the book, it's political. So what is going on with that? So what that objection was raising was saying, to be political, to read that book would be to advocate, would be to send a message that our organization supports the policies of President Barack Obama. In 2009, this is in the moment when we are debating the Affordable Care Act, right? So the country is just embroiled in this debate. And the people objecting to this did not want to be sending the message that this organization was endorsing the policies of the president. So in their view, to be political is to advocate for a particular policy. The people opposed to that were saying, no, there's something else. There's something called a political education. And in a political education, you prepare young people to engage in public debate. You let them understand what the world is. They should understand who their president is. And there's a way to do that that is nonpartisan. Okay, so what this book is about is how to be political, how to engage in political education in a nonpartisan way. So this is the struggle, the central problem of this book. But what's particularly difficult is that because the political climate is so partisan and so divisive, it's very difficult to capture a political education that is not seen as partisan, right? So this is how do we work through this dilemma? So we titled the book The Political Classroom to sort of reclaim the word political. And what we mean by the political classroom are classrooms that help young people learn how to deliberate questions that ask, how should we live together? And questions that ask how should we live together are questions like, should the police be required to have body cameras on them? That's a current debate right now. Should we raise our taxes to fund our local schools? So all of these are the controversial political questions that we think are essential for a good democratic education or a good political education. And when I hand the floor over to Diana, she's going to take you into the political classroom, but I'm going to first keep you outside in the political world and talk about the context in which the book is taking place and which we are all living, which is polarization. So when we think about polarization, you might think immediately of Congress and gridlock and divisiveness and really heated elections. And so what's happening is what you feel is what is actually happening, that you have the political parties are moving into separate poles, and the middle is disappearing, right? So you can feel this in your elections. And I'm going to show you what this looks like in Congress. So some people say, oh, it's kind of always been this way. Hasn't it always been this way? It has not always been this way. So this is a scatter plot, and I'm going to talk you through this really quickly. So each circle is a member of the House of Representatives, and you'll see that this slide is the 1950s. The circle is blue if it's a Democrat, red if it's a Republican. Okay. On the x-axis, the bottom, is the percent to which that member's district voted for the Democratic Party. So this line is roughly 50%. Right of the line is that you're representing a district that voted for the Democratic president, and left of the line is that you're representing a district that voted for the Republican Party. That line is less important than this line for my purposes here. So on the y-axis is a measure of each member's political ideology as based on their voting record in the House. So the black line is at 0. The measure is 0 to 1, so above the line is a conservative voter, a conservative House member, right? Below the line is a liberal, you have a liberal voting record. And so you can see here in the 1950s, what might stand out is there's a lot of blue circles above the line, right? And it's not, so the parties in the 1950s were more purple, less ideologically oriented than they are now. And this makes sense. You might recall that in the 1950s and earlier, we had a conservative branch of the Democratic Party, the Southern Democrats. And so they're voting more conservatively than you might expect today, right? So we see that there's a lot of clustering around the middle, right? So the 0 point, there's a lot of activity. So in the 1960s, the Democrat Party starts to divide over the issues of Vietnam War and civil rights. And the parties are going to resort, and what we call that we're going to move towards an ideologically sorted parties that we see today. So in the 50s and 60s, if you saw someone and said, someone identified a member of the Democratic Party, it was not clear to you then, oh, you must be a liberal, right? But today, we assume that that's true. So in the 1970s, the evangelical Christian movement becomes more political. They're rallying around issues of abortion and school prayer, sex education in schools. So we have a conservative push into the Republican Party on social issues. In the 80s, you can start seeing, there looks like some two poles are emerging. In the 90s, the Republican Party looks almost all over the line. This is the House becomes conservative for the first time in 40 years. This is when Newt Gingrich becomes Speaker of the House. The 2000s, less of a middle, and here's what we're looking like today. And so what you see is that mathematically is that the Republican Party has moved more than the Democrats have moved, right? So they're much higher, further away from the line than the Democrats. So that's the visual of the House activity. Okay, so what does this mean for us as citizens? Well, that's not the whole story, the House membership. There's socially, we're also polarizing. So this is a map of landslide counties during the 2008 election. And so what this is going to show is that we are more likely now than we were prior to the 1980s to live among and work with people who think like we do. So this country seems to be sorting itself out into red and blue counties. So the dark red is a landslide Republican, dark blue is a landslide Democrat, and purple is a divided county. And you might look at this and say, wow, how did Barack Obama win that election? That looks like a lot of red. So I'm going to adjust the map now, and so we're going to expand areas that have high population and shrink areas with low population. And so the map looks like that. So that's New York, and that's Chicago. So you can see that in addition to being a red country and a blue country, we're also an urban country and a rural country, right? So these are very different lived experiences that have similar are mapping onto the ideological landscape. Okay, so what does this mean for us as citizens? In this book, The Disappearing Center, Abramowitz says, asks the question, who's the engaged public now, and what do they look like ideologically? So the engaged public is defined as citizens who care about the government and politics, pay attention to what political leaders are saying and doing, and participate actively in the political process. So these are the types of people you as social studies teachers are hoping to create. It's not just voters, it's the people that are actually interested. They put lawn signs up, they do, they volunteer for campaigns, et cetera. So what's happening with the engaged public? This is a big quantitative study. And what he finds is that since the 1980s, the engaged public has been growing in numbers. And the strongest predictor of being highly engaged, so the highest group, is to have a strong partisan identity and to be ideologically consistent in one's views. So if you imagine how the parties sorted into ideologically, the Republican Party is conservative, the Democratic Party is liberal, we internally have been doing that as well as a result of living in this climate, that if you're very engaged, a lot of your views line up as liberals and a lot of your views line up conservatively. And if you have a strong affection for one political party, you are more likely to become engaged. Okay, So look what's happened since the 1950s. The top line is the participation in presidential elections of strong partisans. It's been going up. But what's really dramatic is the middle, the pure independents have been opting out, right? So as we get more partisan, people in the middle who don't have a strong party affiliation are less likely to come out than those who have more. So we're supporting Congress in its polarization by the partisans being the people who are coming out to put people in office. This is just more recent data on the same story. So likely voters are more ideologically polarized than the public overall. Okay, so if we look here, the dark blue and the dark red, this is of eligible voters, 13% are these ideological partisans on the left, 9% are the ideological partisans on the right. But when we look at likely voters, 19% of the lefty partisans and 17% of the conservative partisans are more likely to come out and vote. And this is, if we look here and here, of the partisans, what is the voting rate of partisans, of the high partisans? Voting at 73%, this is for midterms, and 58% for if you're a strong left-leaning partisan. So they're voting at very high numbers. You can see why the Republicans had a nice sweep in the midterm elections, because they were more likely to go out in the midterms. And so this is the climate in which young people are learning to become political, and this is changing the game. And so the overall effect of this story is that we distrust each other. So we have the people who vote in both the Pew study and the Disappearing Center is what's motivating people to go out is a desire to win and or to get the other side to lose, right? So in the 1950s, when we were purple parties, you went out, you didn't have a clear choice necessarily. I mean, you had a choice between the Democrats and the Republicans, but it wasn't an ideological choice in the way it is today. And so the partisanship is now driving the game. So I'm going to hand it over to Diana now.
Good morning. I want to echo Paula that it's wonderful to be here. I have not been in this state for more than 20 years when I was here during primary season, and I met more politicians during those 2 days than I've met since. So I have a sense of how political this state can be. And as Paula was just talking about, one of the things that we see happening in our larger political climate is polarization. And another thing that we see happening is very rapid change along some key issues. And to illustrate that, what I'd like to do is take you through a little bit of the history of one issue that we heard lots of students talk about in our study that formed the basis of the political classroom, and this is the issue of same-sex marriage. And so what I'd like to show you here is how same-sex marriage developed from 2004 up until the present. So in 2004, as you can see, we only have one state in which same-sex marriage is legal. And then as we go through, we can see that there's change happening slowly after that, with still most states being states that have not legalized same-sex marriage. And in fact, just to go back for a minute, you can see as these states become red, that shows that during this time, there's actually ballot initiatives, constitutional amendments in some cases, that are specifically banning same-sex marriage. But then look what happens. We start seeing very dramatic change, to the point that here in 2014, we've got a virtual split in this country around the legalization of same-sex marriage. Well, the reason that I show that is not because this study is about same-sex marriage per se, but when we were doing this study that formed the basis of the book, The Political Classroom, one of the things we noticed is that in classes that were discussing issues that were changing quite dramatically, teachers had both some opportunities and some challenges that they didn't have around issues where there hadn't been rapid change. So I know that it's easy to say that during any era there's a lot of change. But I think if we look back to the last 15 years, we can see some fundamental issues for which social opinion is changing quite rapidly. And that, as you'll see when we go into this in a little bit, really influenced how teachers behaved. So let's talk a little bit about what formed the basis of the Political Classroom, Evidence and Ethics in Democratic Education. In the first part of the book, we talk about what's going on, as Paula said, outside of schools. And we talk about political polarization, we talk about the rise of economic inequality, and we talk about how social media and the media environment are changing and how that's influencing what young people in particular are doing politically. And all of that formed the context for a study that we started in 2005. And the study was designed to answer three key questions. The first question was, what happens in high school classes where students are being taught how to engage in discussions of controversial political issues, these questions of how we should live together. So literally, how do students experience those classes, and what do students learn from them? And then we were interested in taking it a step further, in taking these kids that we were looking at very intensely when they were in high school and following them out of high school to try to get an answer to the question that I know all of you as social studies teachers wonder about, which is, what difference does this make? So both Paul and I taught high school for a long time. We had the same experiences that I think probably a lot of you have, is that you run into students who graduated and they come back and they say sometimes the strangest things like, I remember so well when we did X, and it can be years later. And it always has been interesting to me to think about, well, what do students remember about what we teach? And what difference does it make in terms of what they do politically and civically when they grow up? So we were interested in systematically studying that. We were also interested in how teachers were making good professional judgments about some of the ethical issues that we knew would arise when they were engaging kids in discussions of these controversial issues. So those were the three main questions of the study. The study involved 35 teachers in 21 schools in 3 states. So the states were Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana. Now, at the time in 2005, those 3 states were really great picks for 2 reasons. One is that we lived in Wisconsin, and we needed to keep relatively close to where we were because we wanted to be in classrooms. We were suspicious of research that just involved people asking students or teachers to fill out surveys without actually being in classrooms and watching what was happening. So we wanted to spend a lot of time interviewing students and interviewing teachers and actually observing in these classrooms. So to do that, we had to stay pretty close to home. But as it turns out, those 3 states were perfect states because at the time, Indiana was a very Republican state. So it was what we would call today a red state. Illinois was a very Democratic state, a blue state, and Wisconsin was just starting to emerge as an almost 50-50 mix, a quintessentially purple state. And as it turned out later, as you're going to see in just a minute, that really made a huge difference in what kids were learning. So how did we actually do this study? We gave students, and most of them were juniors and seniors, surveys at the beginning of their classes and at the end of their classes. One thing that we were interested in was, how do students' views change during the semester-long class or the year-long class, and what difference, if any, does it have to do with their teachers' views? So we had surveys pre and post where we asked lots of things about their views, but lots of things about the class, like what they thought they were learning, how open they thought the climate was, what did they think about their teacher's decision to either share or withhold his or her own political views. And we ask a lot of knowledge questions, like what did they know about how politics was operating, a lot of questions about what kinds of things they thought were more important than other things. So we ask those questions on a pre-survey and on a post survey. And then we went into the schools and we interviewed lots and lots of kids, which of course was fascinating because we learned so much more from the interviews than we learned from the surveys. We did lots of classroom observations, and then we contracted with a survey center at our university, the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and the survey center followed up with these students. So 2 years after they left high school, and then again 4 years after they left high school, they were interviewed on the phone for many cases, really long interviews, sometimes as long as 30 minutes. And you know, these numbers don't look all that hot, really, when you think about it. We had 402 the first time, and then 369 the second time. But only about 650 students had consented to participate in the longitudinal study. So actually, this was kind of fabulous. The Survey Center said to us, we can't believe how many students are participating in this longitudinal follow-up. And the way we did it, it was very interesting, is that we were able to program in for the people who were calling the name of the high school teacher. And so when they were called, the first thing the interviewer said was, do you remember Mr. Smith? He was your American government teacher? And they were like, yeah, I remember Mr. Smith. He was my American government teacher. And therefore, they didn't hang up. So it was kind of one of these brilliant things that enabled us to get a whole lot of information. Well, from all of that information, one of the things that we were interested in is what are the differences between the quality of discussions that are happening in classes. And in all these different classes, we used the survey data, the interviews, and also the observations to kind of sort them into 3 different types. On the bottom, the first type was teachers who, for the most part, lectured. Now, we know this is the case of the norm, right? If we look across what happens in high schools, virtually all kids say virtually all the time they're listening to lectures. And we found that in some of our classes, that the students were listening to lectures, that they were often watching and talking about films, and that they were doing all sorts of small group research and tasks. We don't want to suggest that we didn't see high quality education in these classes. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite teachers was a lecture teacher, and I was in his class one day when he was giving this lecture on the French Revolution, and I was mesmerized. It was like this was one of the best lectures I had ever heard. He had the kids in the palm of his hand. They were really engaged, but they were listening for the most part. Then we had a group of classes that we called discussion classes, where the teachers were still lecturing some, but it was much more interactive. So the teachers often called this lecture discussion, where they said, well, I'm going to talk a little bit, and then I'm going to ask the students to talk. In these classes, we saw lots of sharing by the students, but oftentimes, because they weren't prepared for the discussion, what they were sharing wasn't necessarily all that well informed, but there still was a focus on these controversial political issues. In the third type of class, we called the best practice class, we saw things that were quite different. First, again, we saw this focus on controversial issues. We saw high levels of participation among the students, whereas in the discussion classes, what we would often see is a class of 30 or 35, and you might have 7 or 8 students who are participating very actively, but for the most part, the other students weren't participating verbally, although in many cases they were certainly paying attention. But in these best practice classes, that's not what we saw. We saw discussions in which almost all of the kids were participating in some way, shape, or form, and the participation was often student to student. So it wasn't all being mediated through the teacher. So we would hear students say things like, well, I don't know, Mark doesn't believe X, and the reason I heard him say that I agree with is X, but I actually disagree on this other part. And then someone else would say, well, I don't know, if Sue thinks this, so there was a lot of discussion that looked like this. The teachers still played a very active role, and specifically the role the teacher played that was so important was making sure the students were well prepared. So students didn't come into these discussions without having read something about the issue, often without having written something about the issue, without having thought about it. And when we interviewed these teachers, they said to us, you know, spontaneous discussions don't work. And the reason they don't work is students aren't prepared. And so what you get is a small group of students who might be prepared and might have something to say, but the other students very quickly back out because they recognize that they don't really know enough to talk. So the one thing we learned in these best practice classrooms is that the key difference was all students were prepared to talk in some way that the teacher had engineered. This didn't happen just by some miracle. And we also noticed that in these classes, the teachers had lots of small group activities going on that were designed to prepare for larger group discussions. So what did we learn in terms of this question about how do students experience and learn from high quality, or what we called best practice discussions? Well, here are some key things that we saw as findings. One is that students described themselves as learning within a democratic community. So they described their classroom often by using the word we. As a matter of fact, we had this one really interesting school where we had one teacher who was a best practice teacher. We had another teacher who was a lecture teacher, but really an engaging lecture teacher. And students liked both of these classes. But 4 years later, when we asked the question, what do you remember about those classes? In the best practice discussion class, many of the students, more than 30 of the students said, we. I remember that we did this. I remember that we disagreed about this issue. I remember that we really struggled to talk about this issue in a way that was highly civil. In the other classroom, which was in the same school, same student population, we didn't hear we at all. It was all singular. I remember this, I remember that, I remember things about the teacher. Whereas in the other class, they remembered things about the class. And they even used the names of their fellow students, and this was 4 years later, so it was quite remarkable. We also learned that in these classes where there were enough discussions of controversial political issues, that students found them highly engaging and quite different than what they were experiencing in other classes that they were taking. They liked these discussions, and they liked them especially because they thought they were civil. They weren't afraid of them. They didn't think the discussions were creating a climate that was dangerous to them interpersonally or personally, but instead they found them really engaging, and they described in some detail what they learned from them. They reported that the climate in their classroom was open. So what does that mean? So this thing called open classroom climate means that students are saying, in my class, we discuss issues. And in my class, we discuss issues that people disagree about. But in my class, the teacher wants to hear our opinions. And in my class, we feel confident that we can share our true opinions. So in other words, kids felt like they weren't being penalized for telling the truth. The students in these classes also learned that it was important to consider differing points of views before they made a decision. So one of the things that we heard from class after class after class is students being surprised that their classmates disagreed with them. And in the classes where there were lecture, the students would say, everyone in this class thinks the same thing. In the classes where there was discussion, students said, you know, there's a lot of disagreement in this class. So that led us to this finding that was something like this, that what you want to do is activate the awareness of difference in a classroom. Because if students can hear peers disagree with one another in a respectful way, that's going to cause them to be less conflict adverse and to be more open to the exact opposite of what Paula was talking about. So when Paula was talking about polarization, one of the things we know is we've seen the development of this phenomenon which we call affective, not effective, but affective political polarization, which means essentially this, that people are not only saying, well, gosh, I have these views and the other side has those views, but more than 50% of Republicans and almost 50% of Democrats say, I think the views of the other side are literally dangerous to the future of this country. literally dangerous to the future of this country. So that's a level of polarization that's really extreme. And what we saw in this best practice classroom phenomenon is that students who recognized that there was difference, but these were, in many cases, their friends. You know, people that they were on the basketball team with, people that they did things with, but all of a sudden they realized these people who they had good relationships with, they were their friends, actually disagreed with them. That was a good thing, because that reinforced what I think is an important thing in the American political system, is that we can disagree about political issues without thinking that the people who have different views from us are in some ways inherently evil. We also learned from these students that they started talking about politics socially and at home. So what the students would report is, like, we had this one student who said, yeah, you know, last night the State of the Union address was on, and I sat down and watched it with my mom, and it was very bonding, and which was such a great quote. But then he went on to say, before this class, I wouldn't have done that. I probably would have gone bowling, which I thought was kind of odd, you know. Like, doesn't he know that we don't bowl anymore? But I guess in his community, you know, there was a lot of bowling going on. But what he was reporting was he was much more interested in talking about politics, both socially with his friends outside of school and also with his family. The other thing we saw is that the general knowledge about how government and politics works increased in these classes. That the students became more interested in politics and more interested in following the news, which is incredibly important because we know that people who follow the news are more likely to participate because they're going to understand at a higher degree what's going on. And the main reason people don't participate is because they don't feel like they know enough to really make a decision. And so as we see attention to news going down dramatically across the country, and especially among young people, I think we need to be worried about, well, what can we do to reverse that? And one of the things we saw in these best practice classrooms is that following the news increased. And finally, these students reported that they'd be more likely to vote in the future when they were legally old enough to vote. So another thing we were interested in, though, and I want to go back to the blue state, red state, purple state, is what difference did it make if students were in a classroom where there was a lot of pre-existing ideological diversity compared to classrooms in which there wasn't as much ideological diversity? So to study that, we first asked students the question of who they would have voted for had they been old enough to vote in the 2004 election. And you can see in this class, Mrs. Heller's class, that a number of the students said they would have voted for the Democratic candidate, and a number of students said they would have voted for the Republican candidate, and the one student who's gray said he would have voted for Ralph Nader. So this looks like a pretty purple class so far, right? And then we asked some questions about controversial political issues that were important at the time. So one question was about taxation, and another question was about abortion. And then there was a question about civil liberties and terrorism, which certainly, given what's happened this week, we know how important this question is once again. A question about the death penalty, a question about whether charity was better than welfare as a way of dealing with income inequality and dealing with helping poor people, and a question about legalizing civil unions. Now, what's interesting about this map is you see all this gray. What does gray mean? Gray means the kids said that they were either undecided or didn't know. And what we found across all the kids and all the questions is about 30% of the time kids were undecided or didn't know at the beginning of class. Now, I was really intrigued by that because when I taught high school and I would ask a student, well, what do you think about the death penalty? And the student would say, I don't know. I thought the student was being kind of oppositional or just kind of being a jerk, to be honest. And now I realize I would need to go back and apologize for thinking that because, in fact, these students were telling the truth. Let's move on to another class. So this is, not surprisingly, a class in a very blue community. In fact, this is one of the most democratic communities in the United States. The 3 precincts that feed into this school are among the most left-wing precincts in the United States. And in this classroom, Mr. Kushner, who was really a fantastic teacher, had a much different problem than would exist in Mrs. Heller's class, where there was a lot of existing diversity. In Mr. Kushner's class, he had to worry about how to make sure that kids heard multiple and competing views. We asked the students in Mr. Kushner's class what they thought about whether they were hearing different views, and because Mr. Kushner killed himself to do all sorts of things to get different views in the class, they said, wow, this class is really different because we were exposed to competing views. And we asked him, well, what do you mean compared to your other classes in this school? And he said famously, to us anyway, well, let me tell you, in this school, we've seen every Michael Moore film twice. And now let me show you the most read school in the study. This was an evangelical Christian high school where students and their parents had to sign a contract saying they'd been personally saved to get into the school. Again, you can imagine that Mr. Walters had a quite different problem than you would have in a purple classroom, and he in some ways had the same kind of problem that Mr. Kushner had. So what did we learn from this? That in the classes where there was a lot of diversity, like Mrs. Heller's classes, that what the teachers had to do was to make sure that all kids talked, because you wanted to activate the natural diversity that happened in the classrooms. And they really had to emphasize civil discourse, how to talk with one another in a way where people can feel respected, not feel like they're being personally insulted. And that was important because the students really did disagree, and how to promote a respect for difference and teach toward getting kids highly engaged politically. Whereas in these other classrooms where they're much more homogeneous, teachers had to work to introduce competing points of view. They often did that by either playing devil's advocate, bringing in materials, sometimes even bringing in guest speakers to represent a point of view that wasn't already existing in the classroom. They had to really work hard at teaching kids that ideological closed-mindedness was a bad thing. So there was a lot of discussion about why it's important to be free to change your mind, why it's important to not make up your mind and then look for reasons, but to think carefully about what the reasons are before you make up your mind. And also to seek out the natural diversity that did exist on some issues. So what you can see from these maps is that there's some things here that look like real winners, right? That you could just go in and get high quality discussions, of course, with preparation. There are other things that aren't going to be quite as positive. So what did we learn, though, is that in these like-minded classrooms, and by like-minded we mean there was a lot of ideological sharedness, that the students at the pre-survey reported that they were much more engaged politically. And then in the follow-ups, they reported that they were more likely to keep up with the news, and that they were more likely to say that friends and family think it's important to keep up with the news. So that means that they're in a political environment, right, that they report that they're surrounded by other people who also think this is important. And what we found when we followed them out after high school was, in our minds, quite frightening. First, we found that in the midterm elections in 2006, that we know, similar to this election, that the youth vote was low, although it was worse this time. In the purple schools, about 30% of the students in our sample voted, which is a little higher than average, but look at this. Now let's take it 2 years later to the 2008 presidential election. We know that the national youth vote was 49%, pretty high, and in some states really, really high. And that in the purple schools, we had 66% of our students voting, which is quite higher than the average. But look at the like-minded schools. So let's look at who they voted for. Well, not surprisingly, the kids coming from the purple schools voted in the way that the youth vote went nationally. This is 1% away from how young people voted nationally for Obama, whereas 28% voted for McCain. But then look at in that red school, the Evangelical Christian High School, who they voted for, and look at Mr. Kushner's school, right? So it's pretty interesting. We'll talk later about what you think that might mean. Let me end by just saying one final thing about what we did in the book. What we were trying to focus on was how can teachers make good judgments about ethical questions? And specifically, the ethical questions that we were interested in were questions that are probably quite familiar to you. One question was, what questions should be introduced as controversial to begin with? Like, what's legitimately controversial versus what's a question that's out of bounds for some way or settled? Another question was, are there some issues that are so sensitive to some students that they shouldn't be brought into the classroom? And finally, an issue that Paul is going to help us think about in the next session, whether teachers should withhold or share their own political views. Well, these issues and others came up all over the study. So what we were interested in was coming up with a framework for how teachers might make good judgments about these questions. And the framework, which we're going to work with you on throughout the day, involves thinking carefully about what the aims of what you're trying to do are, thinking carefully about the evidence, like what do we know about whether kids change their views when teachers share their views, what do we know about how kids who are particularly sensitive to some issues react compared to other kids, and also understanding the broader context, not just the context in your school, but the broader context, for example, of political polarization and economic inequality that are on the rise in the United States. So in a nutshell, that is what we talk about in the book, The Political Classroom, Evidence and Ethics in Democratic Education. What we'd like to do now is take some questions. And I'm going to ask Paula to come up with me so we're both here to answer them. And it's wide open. Any questions you have about anything, go ahead.
I think it's a great thing to teach our kids we want them to encourage them to follow the news. My personal frustration with the news and something that scares me about getting students into the routine of following the news is that we know there's a lot of media bias out there. And, thank you. How can we encourage, or how should we be encouraging and facilitating students' engagement in the news so that they're aware of media bias and can navigate that once they've left our classroom?
That's a great question. I'm going to let Paula start because she's been doing a lot of work on what we know about what people do watch when they watch the news, and then I'll follow up with a little bit about what we know about how kids are learning about how to deal with media bias.
Right, so the research is showing that the good and bad news is that people aren't really watching the news much. I mean, watching television news is actually on the decline. Internet sources is on the rise, but I do think that there's a lot of work to be done for teachers on media literacy and how do you teach people to recognize biases? What is it? I mean, I think in the book we talk about political literacy. Is one purpose of trying to help young people engage in the political world and understand the political world is to understand polarization and to understand can you hear this view and recognize, that's conservative or that's liberal? That's a hard thing for people to understand as young people and as adults, but I do think that that's one of the aims of the political classroom is to be literate in a way that you can understand ideological slant. I don't have a good answer of the exact technique to use in the classroom, but there's a lot of work being done on that.
I think the worst case scenario is if people are getting their news from one highly ideological source. So people who are getting all their news from MSNBC or all their news from Fox, we know a lot from research about what people are learning from those highly ideological sources. So it isn't the case that all news is the same. There's some news that's more ideological than others. That being said, as Paula mentioned, if most people aren't watching the news anyway, it probably doesn't make that much difference. It's more important with young people to look at where they're getting their news. And increasingly where they're getting their news, Twitter. And so one of the things that a number of organizations are working on, specifically the McCormick Foundation in Chicago, is working with teachers to develop ways of helping kids understand what is more or less ideological and what is more or less warrantable in these news sources that look quite different than where we would go traditionally. And what we do know is that in high-quality media literacy programs that are often part of social studies, they're not separate classes, but in those programs where kids are being taught explicitly how to do this, that they are learning how to do it, that they are able to get a sense of what is more or less warrantable. But the problem is this, is that we don't want to create total news cynics, right? Because if we create total news cynics, then nobody's going to pay any attention to the news. And if nobody pays any attention to the news, they're not going to participate. We know that participation and news go hand in hand. So it's one of these weird things where as teachers, we both have to teach kids how to deal with a very ideological space. At the same time, we don't teach kids that there's nothing of value in that space. One teacher that I do a lot of work with will assign her kids to watch to actually watch television news across the ideological spectrum. So she will say, pick a story that's a big story today and spend 10 minutes watching Fox, 10 minutes watching MSNBC, 10 minutes watching CNN, 10 minutes watching the NewsHour, and try to report what the difference is. That is very illuminating to kids, right? Because they oftentimes aren't aware that what they're watching is different than something else unless they see that difference. Let's go to the next question.
Hi. I'm new to the classroom myself and new to trying some of these ideas out. And I've been teaching a civics class for the past month and a half. We have it in my school. We have it in quarters. And I had a check-in with my students recently. And they're freshmen, so 14, 15 years old. And one of the frustrations that was expressed to me so far was, you know, in each one of these issues, we've talked so far about U.S. drone strikes. We just finished a unit on illegal immigration. There's not a clear pro or con side for me to go to. It's like we've tried to cover both sides, and they get frustrated with that gray area. And so one of the things that I was struggling with explaining to the student in the class was, you know, sometimes it's not necessarily the case that you have a pro or a con side. I didn't know if in your research you found certain classrooms where that was either a consistent challenge or how certain teachers handled that kind of issue, if there were, maybe with younger students, introducing them to something that had a little bit more of a clear, you know, here's one side, here's the other side. I wasn't sure if you could speak to any of that.
Well, one thing you should know is that there's some excellent materials published by the Kettering Foundation called the National Issues Forum. And the National Issues Forum doesn't present issues as pro-con. There's always at least 3, and in many cases 4 alternatives. On foreign policy issues and some issues related to U.S. history, the Choices for the 21st Century program, which is at Brown University, similarly produces materials that don't do binary work, that instead have several choices. And we had a number of those classes in our study, so we watched students in those classes and the difference between making selections between 3 or 4 possibilities compared to 2. But the other thing is we had this one remarkable school in our study that engaged kids in a semester-long legislative simulation. And I'm going to turn it over to Paula to talk a little bit about how the kids created what it was they were going to discuss, because I think that's a solution to this as well. Yeah.
Okay. So very briefly, one of the chapters in the book focuses solely on Adams High, and the teachers, all of the government teachers participate in this required non-tracked senior government course, and the entire course is structured around a legislative simulation. So the first 2 weeks of the course, they're learning about political parties, how issues fit along the continuum. Then they declare party affiliation publicly in the school. Then they spend several weeks, they form a legislation, they elect party membership, they become members of committees, they write bills, they usher them through, and then twice a semester, all of the seniors, so about 200 to 300 seniors, come to the auditorium and they debate the bills that have come to the floor. But what the teachers do really well in that class is that they're scaffolding discussion a lot of structured sort of teacher orchestrated discussion at the beginning of the term, and then they're slowly pulling back until when the students are doing the legislative simulation at the end, you don't even know who the teachers are at this school. They're literally sitting in the back just watching them do their thing. And so to really think carefully about what type of discussion do I want at the end of the term, and how am I building their skills so that they can have that by the end is it's an art that's well worth working on. Yeah.
The other thing is that the kids have to craft their own bills. So in order to get a bill to move forward, they have to make compromises. So oftentimes, the most extreme solutions aren't the solutions that are going to get through their committees. So they are actually having to say, well, what is a third possibility or a fourth possibility here? So that's really high-level cognitive work. It's very difficult. But in those classes, when we interviewed the kids 2 and 4 years later, they had a lot more respect for how difficult it is to craft legislation that gets passed. And we were intrigued by that because we weren't hearing that from any other of the schools engaged in the study.
I'll just add a little bit that what
Go
you're
ahead,
describing is, I think, developmental as well. Like, it's just a hard thing to learn how to do. You think that there's a lot of the students in the best practice classes said, I thought that these things were sort of easy, but it turns out they're really murky and hard to figure. I mean, I think that's sort of the fun, if you can get them to realize the fun.
Another question, please. Go ahead.
What's your opinion about the teacher declaring their political affiliation?
So that is such a great question, and we are going to focus for 45 minutes on it right after our break. And to be fair, we're going to have you working on that problem, and at the end, we'll come back for more questions, and if you want to ask us again, we'll answer it at that point. But right now, we're not going to disclose our view on disclosure. Let's have one more question before we take a break.
Thank you so much, Diana and Paula, for this terrific presentation so far. Is it possible to pull up the slide where you list all the positive outcomes of this kind of work? I think back to a fellow named Ted Sizer, who wrote a book called Horace's Compromise and Horace's School. And a lot of teachers in social studies are struggling with the depth versus breadth issue. I got to cover all this material. And it's all, and I've done a lot of research on with teachers, and it's all self-imposed for the most part. We have no excuses as social studies educators to cover every mountain of minutia any longer because we don't have tests, and the Common Core is simply language arts and math. And so I always ask teachers, if you're going to say less is more, what is the more that you get from doing less? And that is the list that you might want to start giving your administrator or colleagues when they sit in the lunchroom and they proudly say, I'm 6 chapters ahead of you. And less is more. And interestingly, in your research, you get more content knowledge by covering less through this issue-based approach. I just wanted to give a plug for less is more, but we've got to articulate what that means.
Yeah, let me say something about that. I've been really intrigued by this problem for a long time because when I started teaching high school social studies a very, very long time ago, there was a split in our department between people who really believed it was important when teaching U.S. history in particular to cover a lot of content, and other teachers who really believed it was important for the students to uncover a lot of understanding. Those were 2 very, very different paradigms, and as is the case in many social studies departments, it was hard for us to practice what we preached. We often didn't talk about these quite as civilly as we could have. But what I learned from that eventually was that it doesn't have to be an either or. We often think about things that, we can either have kids do things in depth or we can have kids learn a lot. That's not the way to think about it. The way to think about it is a Venn diagram, that if we go in depth about really important things, and this is why what we select to have kids study really matters, content matters a ton, what they do and in depth and what they'll learn, there's a really powerful overlap there. And we know that when we ask kids to just memorize tons and tons of information, what we know from the brain research now is it's not working anyway, right? Which is why so much of what kids memorize in high school, when you ask them a year or 2 years later, they literally have no idea. Whereas, and let me end with this before we take a break, one of the things we were amazed by when we read the transcripts from the Survey Center having these long interviews with 400 kids 2 and 4 years later, is that in these best practice classes, the kids' memory of what had happened was crystal clear. It was amazing. They remembered what issues had been talked about. They remembered what the division is in their class. They remembered what the teacher did pedagogically. They had very, very, very clear memories. In the other classes, the kids' memories were not quite as clear, and they tended to be about whether they liked the teacher or not. I really liked him because one kid said he really wore funny sweaters. Well, that's great, but it was for us a much better outcome when a kid said, wow, what I remember from that class is I really learned how to listen to people I disagreed with, because when we had this discussion on abortion, here's what it went like, and boom, 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 boom. So that says something to me about the larger point that Joe is raising, that we need to really think carefully about depth. And we have been released in many cases from what other teachers are focused on, not always. But I always think that there's kind of a Stockholm syndrome here. You know what that is? When the prisoner gets out and then walks back into the prison. Well, I think, in some places, teachers had lots of content they had to cover because there's these state tests. And then the state tests go away, and you know what? Their curriculum doesn't change. And when you ask them why not, they say, well, I have to cover all this content. And it's almost like Oz, this notion that there's someone or something that's causing me to feel like I have to cover all this content. But when you really pull the curtain back, it's pretty self-imposed. So I think we all need to think about it. And I appreciate how difficult it is as a teacher who still plans courses, because we always have a lot that we want students to learn. Let's take a break, and then we're going to come back for more work on this disclosure question and on some others, and you'll have plenty of opportunities for questions. So how about if we come back and
hour, and so what I'm going to do is give you some information. We're going to go deep into one of the political classrooms that are covered in the book, and we should say that the book, a lot of the chapters in the book are really rich cases of a teacher's practice, and we go in depth. What are students doing in the class? What's the teacher doing? What do students say about what the teacher's doing? And so we're going to go into one of these sort of rich case studies in this book, or in this chapter. And then so just as a reminder, the political classroom, we're looking at questions about how we should live together, and that one part of the book is to engage in these. So what are these ethical challenges that teachers are going to face when they go into the political classroom? And so one of them is, we're going to talk in depth about this today. So the classroom that we're going to go into is Mr. Dunn's class. And Mr. Dunn's class was observed in 2005, and in one of his observations, I should say. And in the lesson observed, the question before the class was, should the government define marriage as a union between one man and one woman? And I'll just remind you, it's 2005. That sounds like a little bit of a dated question, or we don't sort of phrase that question usually that way now. But at the time, again, in 2004, Massachusetts was the only state where same-sex marriage was legal. 13 states the next year changed their constitutions to define marriage in this way, as a union between one man and one woman. George Bush at the time had said that he would support such an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So this is why Mr. Dunn has phrased the question the way he did. In the first part of the class, the students engaged in what's known as a structured academic controversy, and some of you may know this technique, in which it's a discussion strategy in which groups of 4 students are given background materials and pro-con sheets about an issue, and then they role play taking different perspectives on the issue, and then in the last part of the activity, they get to discuss in their small group about what they feel about this particular issue. So to debrief that activity, Mr. Dunn asked the class to stand along a continuum to reflect their views on this statement: the government should define marriage as a union between one man and one woman. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? So when the students lined up, something interesting happened. They all went from the disagree side, that is, they did not think that the government should define marriage in this way, or to the middle of where unsure. But no one stood on the agree side, that is, no one said that they wanted to defend the view that marriage should be defined as a union between one man and one woman. Okay. So you imagine that Mr. Dunn, so imagine that you're Mr. Dunn for a moment, your students lined up in this way. So I want you to meet with a partner, not with your whole table, but just with one partner, turn, and I want you to consider what you think Mr. Dunn should do. And I'll give you 4 options, and these are also on the handout that Diana just passed around. So number 1, should Mr. Dunn step onto the agree side of the continuum and defend those views? That is, should he go where no student is currently standing and defend the more conservative view to keep marriage as a union between one man and one woman? Should he do that, but before he does that, should he say to the class, and we know from his interviews and his surveys that Mr. Dunn was a proponent of marriage equality, and so should he say to the class, I agree with those of you who are opposed to the statement, but for the good of the discussion, I'm going to stand on the agree side and defend those views. So both of these, Mr. Dunn would play the devil's advocate, but in option 2, he would make it clear, these are my views, but this is what I'm going to do right now. Option 1 is a little bit ambiguous. The students are not sure what his actual views are. Should he instead just go step on the line as the students are and to the point that reflects his actual views and facilitate the discussion from there as the teacher / participant? Or should he not step onto the line at all and facilitate a discussion among the range of views that currently exist within the class? Okay, so devil's advocate down to just work with the students where they are. So with your partner, which option do you think would be best for Mr. Dunn?